Speaker.
What is the amendment number?
Amendment number 243621/1.
Amendment number 1.
Move so much be considered the reading of the amendment.
So order.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, what this amendment would do is address an issue that I think is very much relevant to the police accountability conversation, and that is the issue of police or SROs in schools. What we've seen from the Maryland State Department of Education is that close to 70% of school-based arrests were for minor infractions. And what do I mean by minor infractions? 70% of school-based arrests were for disruption. It were for fighting, trespassing, drug-related offenses. 70% of school-based arrests were for minor infraction, and of that percentage, Black students accounted for a large portion of that. Black students account for a third of enrollment in Maryland public schools, but 56% of school-based arrests, as I mentioned earlier, for minor infractions. Oftentimes when we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, what is neglected from that conversation is the role that SROs or police play in perpetuating that school-to-prison pipeline that siphons Black, brown, LGBTQ+, and students with disabilities from the classroom to the jailhouse. And that is reflected in the data that we're seeing here. In my own county, Montgomery County, Black students account for a fifth of enrollment in Montgomery County public schools and over half of all of its arrests. We are forcing young people to navigate a criminal legal system that not only undervalues them, that not only does not see their dignity, but is putting them on a pipeline that introduces them to a criminal legal system that will determine their life trajectory. What I'm hoping, since I believe it should have also been addressed in the education conversation, but since we're talking about police accountability, that we could address this issue. Because, as folks know, the General Assembly passed legislation around this issue. And what we have in essence done is sort of played a role in the kind of a data that we're seeing coming out from the SRO program in schools. A third of enrollment and 56% of arrests. What other demographic group would we accept this kind of a data for? We would not accept this data if in a particular school district, wealthy kids were being arrested at the rate that Black and brown and LGBTQ+ kids and kids with disabilities are being arrested. We would not accept this data if it had showed that white students or white children were being disproportionately impacted as a result of police or SROs in schools. But what the data is showing is that the people who are impacted are the people that look like me. And we cannot afford to ignore that data. And what this amendment would do is ensure that we are removing SROs from schools, because quite frankly, I think we should be investing in the evidence-based solutions that will keep all of our children in our schools safe. Safety doesn't always look like an armed person or an armed police officer patrolling streets or patrolling hallways. Understanding that these are officers and police as a matter of law. And they are charged with not only enforcing the law, but at times seeing the very people in these schools as criminals and as offenders. And I think we should see the inherent dignity of each and every one of our children, not criminals, but as children who are deserving of affirmation and support. And this amendment that I submitted would not only remove SROs from schools, but would allow us to invest in those very same evidence-based solutions. I move the amendment, Madam Speaker.
Chair of Ways and Means.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There is a live bill in the Ways and Means Committee that includes most of the provisions that the delegate is speaking of today. So I say leave it to the Ways and Means Committee. Thank you.
Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker.
Gentleman who made the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I said, from my county, which the good delegate and chair also represents, we see the troubling data that is coming out. This troubling data warrants action, and our inaction would only tell families, would only tell communities, and those young children who have been impacted as a result of being put in that school to prison pipeline, those who are still dealing with the trauma, those who are still dealing with navigating a complex legal system, those who are still dealing with trauma. That is the reality of young people. And as I said earlier, we would not accept this data for any other demographic. What about Black, brown, LGBTQ+, and children with disabilities that we are not willing to act? And that's really the fundamental question, because the data is troubling and it warrants action. I press the amendment, Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from St. Mary's.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Couple questions for maker of the amendment.
Yes, Delegate.
I want to make sure I understand what your amendment does. So your amendment would ban SROs in the state of Maryland? Is that correct?
It would restrict as the amendment says, Delegate, it would restrict a local school system from contracting with certain law enforcement agencies to, in essence, have regular and routine armed officers patrolling schools. What it does not do is stop an administrator, a principal, or anyone from calling police to the school. What it does is it would end the regular and routine presence of police in our schools, because as the data shows, police presence in schools has a negative and disproportionate impact on Black, Latinx, LGBTQ+, and students with disabilities, according to the data from the Maryland Department of Education.
That was a long answer for yes. So, I mean, this kind of sticks with me because I don't know if you were here in the General Assembly at the time, but about 2 or 3, 4 years ago, we had a school shooting in St. Mary's County where the SRO stopped it and performed pretty well. So this kind of sticks to me that we were going to be forced to give up our SROs, and I think parents wouldn't agree with that. I do want to ask the maker of the amendment, because he's talked about a lot of data. Do you know how many students are in the school system, public school system in the state of Maryland?
I do not.
Okay, I pulled up some data here when you were offering your last amendment. I'm on the Department of Education site, and it says we have 800, and approximately just a little over, and this is for the school year 2018 and 19. That's what all we had the latest data on. It says we have over 894,000 students in the state of Maryland in our public school system. Do you know how many have been arrested by SROs?
I know how many Black students have been arrested by SROs, yes.
I can give you how many Black students have been arrested by SROs, but do you know how many total students have been arrested by SROs?
I do not.
Okay. Well, that would be 2,628 students. 2,600, just a little over 2,600 out of 894,000 students. And the maker of the amendment asked about Black students. That would be 1,766 out of the total 894,000 students. So you didn't know how many students we have. You didn't know how many kids were arrested by SROs, but now you're trying to ban SROs. I just got further questions for you. Do you have any idea how many might have been arrested for physical altercations in the schools? I'll give you that data. 732. Now, There's also was 25 arrested for sexual attacks. There was 20 arrested for sexual harassment. There was 11 arrested for guns, and for other weapons in our schools, there was 222. My question for you is, if the SRO isn't there, if we eliminate it, who takes those other weapons out of the schools? Who stops those sexual assaults?
So we have an opportunity to reimagine school safety that does not include an armed police officer constantly patrolling and seeing students as inherent criminals. What we know from the Maryland Department of Education is that it's close to 70% of school-based arrests are for minor infractions. And so if we remove SROs, we have an opportunity to then invest in the evidence-based solutions, which we already know what that is, whether it's beefing up security and controlled access at schools, whether it's investing in counselors, social workers, restorative justice practitioners, more nurses, the very people who can handle what it is that you're talking about. You do not always need an armed officer responding, and particularly to a concern that involves children. We have people who are able to do this. But what is the data is showing, and we have a responsibility to legislate based on data, is that it has a disproportionate impact on certain students. And if your argument is that, well, because it is a small portion, because it's only a little over 2,600 students that are arrested, and of that portion, X amount are arrested for X and Y amount is arrested for Z, what we're saying that it is okay for a few students to have a traumatic experience that puts them in the school to prison pipeline because the numbers are so low. The goal here is to keep all of our kids safe, not some, not a segment, not a few, all of our kids. And that requires us to think outside of the box and reimagine school safety that does not include an armed police officer, which, according to data, has shown that active shooters do not stay away from a school because there is an SRO posted there. So again, we can legislate based on data, or we can legislate based on emotions, because the delegate is talking about he's having an emotional defense to, the very amendment, when we can actually root it in the evidence-based solutions that will keep all, not some, all of our kids safe.
Madam Speaker, on the amendment.
On the amendment.
Whew, I won't make the mistake of asking more questions. Look, we could talk about the data. I'm not making an emotional argument. I'm making a data-driven argument. And I guess maybe an emotional plea as well. I mean, this is important to my county. I mean, the SRO probably ended up saving some students a few years back when we had this incident. And the maker of the amendment doesn't seem to really know the data behind it. It just seems like a lot of rhetoric. Because when we were originally talking, when he answered the floor leader about Montgomery County, let's talk about Montgomery County a little bit. It's a huge county. It has 162,680 public students there. And the maker of the amendment said, well, half the students that were arrested were people of color. Well, here's the thing. There's 163 students arrested. 163 out of 162,000. And he's right. Half of them were people of color. It was 73. 73, and only 30 people total in all Montgomery County schools were arrested by SROs. So we're asked, we need to start focusing on the victims and the people that are actually being protected by these good police officers in our schools. And we're asked to reimagine policing. Well, I'm asking the maker of the amendment to reimagine why the cops were there in the first place. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I urge a red vote on this amendment.
Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from Howard.